Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is AP World History, Mr. Ansharsky, Unit 5, Chapter 3, Re-upload. Whoa. Why is it re-uploaded? Well, I like this presentation that I made a little bit better than the one that I initially recorded last year. So today is going to be about Latin American independence. The reason why I'm changing it is I'm kind of streamlining it. The most important things you would need to know are causes and results. And then also this guy named Simón Bolívar. He's a very important figure in Latin American history, and we'll talk about him. Bell work on the screen. How is the Enlightenment influencing revolutionary movements? So you could pick any revolution we talked about, but also you could even pick out things like abolition or early feminism with Mary Wollstonecraft, Olympe de Gouges, those sorts of people. All righty then. So this is the third chapter of this unit. This is the last chapter about political revolutions in the age of revolutions. And we're going to look at independence in Latin America and a little bit about what will happen after independence, just a tiny bit. Lesson objective on the board right there, causes and effects of Latin American revolutions. So ideally, you should pick one, because on the AP exam, they're not going to expect that every single AP World History class covered the exact same specific subject. AP World History is about broad themes. And today we're looking at broad themes of Latin American independence, and then I give you some examples of those broad themes. So I will give you the example of Gran Colombia, of Mexico, of Argentina, and of some other place. Mexico, Argentina, Gran Colombia, Brazil. There we go. So I would be familiar with at least one. So when you're studying for the AP exam come May, hopefully you would be able to recall at least one Latin American revolution. And I'm just going to suggest it. It's the one that involves Simón Bolívar. He is the most important figure of this chapter. So let's first look at general themes. What are some general causes of the of Latin American independence? Well, generally, we have a few long-term causes. You can probably guess, if you've seen all these other videos, what the first long-term cause is. It's the freaking Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is the intellectual justification for revolutions in the period between 1750 and 1900. So ideas of liberalism, the idea that government should have a limited role in the economy, the idea of having a republic, the idea of having democratically elected representatives, the idea of having a government that respects private property, the idea of property being a natural right. All of these things are related to the Latin American independence movement. So the Enlightenment is going to be something that will generally be the intellectual justification for independence movements. A lot of these societies in post-Latin America, they are going to experiment or try ideas of Enlightenment style government, basically. There are a few other related causes as well, long-term causes that kind of connect us to Unit 4 in our discussion on Spanish and Portuguese colonies. Well, remember in Spanish and Portuguese colonies, there was something called the castas system. The castas system is a racial/social hierarchy, socio-racial economic hierarchy that divided new Spanish colonies into different categories. Who was on top of all of this? It was the peninsulares, those who were born in Spain, who lived in the colonies. Peninsulares, thanks to things like the Bourbon reforms, thanks to things like the Palmeline reforms in Portugal, they were the ones that had absolute power over the colonies, economically, socially, politically. So this kind of race-based hierarchy is causing tensions, especially between this upper class of peninsulares, of whites born in Europe, and the group of people who want to be in power, the Creoles. The Creoles, those are white people born in the colonies. They are people of European descent born in the colonies. And the Creoles are mostly property owners. They are mostly wealthy white elites. And they believe, much like the Americans did in their independence war, that their class of people, these white property owners born in the Americas, they should be the ones in charge of colonial society. In general, the Creoles tended to be in support of independence, in general. At the very least, they wanted to have some more power in colonial societies. So Creoles tended to want to advance their interests. A general cause of revolutions and a general theme of Latin America is that white property owners, especially Creoles, wanted to maintain their social status even after independence. So we are going to see that this castas system does provide a long-term reason why the Latin American independence movements will happen. The dislike of mercantilism, we kind of talked about that back in Unit 4. This idea that government regulates the trade of what colonies can produce and where they export their goods and what goods they import. So the ideas of mercantilism conflict with ideas of free trade capitalism. So economically, that will be a big motivation for independence in Latin American societies. It's similar to the United States. But what immediately is going to set off Latin American independence? Well, a few things. Well, one thing, inspiration from other revolutions. Woohoo! White property owners in the United States got their independence. They created a republic that respects natural rights like property, and they kept all of their power, those rich white people. Why don't we do that in our society as well? That's what Latin American Creoles will tend to say. The French Revolution, of course, the inspiration of ideas of natural rights, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, that will be also a template for many of these independent societies in Latin America. So the French Revolution is inspiration. We'll kind of talk about how indirectly the French Revolution led to Spanish independence in the New World, in the colonies. But also, how did lower class people, how did people on the lower end of the casta system get involved in Latin American independence? Well, there is going to be kind of this language of trying to get people of African and Native American descent on board with independence. And kind of as a model for that is the inspiration of the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution and its radical abolishment of slavery will be a big kind of thing that Native and people of African descent want to try and emulate in their society. They want to create a society without those racial barriers. They won't be very successful, as we'll see. That will be a big problem in post-independence Latin American countries, the idea of racial hierarchies. But nevertheless, all of these three earlier revolutions will impact Latin American independence. But finally, the thing that immediately sets off Latin American independence is a question of who governs these colonies. And that question will come as a result of Napoleon's invasion of Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula. In the early 1800s, Napoleon, as you remember from last presentation or the presentation before, I can't remember, Napoleon invaded basically half of Europe. And when he did that, he replaced a lot of the older kings in Europe, including the one in Spain, including the one in Portugal. In fact, he put his brother in charge of Spain, for example. So when Napoleon invaded Spain and Portugal, there's suddenly no more Spanish king. So there is a question now, who is in charge of the colonies? Who is in charge of overseeing colonial affairs? Because there's no more Spanish king. And remember, in comparison to English colonies, Spain and Portugal had a bigger say directly in the affairs of their societies in the New World. So when Napoleon suddenly kicks out the King of Spain, when the King of Spain abdicates, we are going to see that the colonies, in order to provide some social order, in order to provide some political order, are going to form temporary governments called juntas. And a junta, a temporary government that forms, essentially is a placeholder. They get together, they make a government. What will we do since there is no king anymore? How will we administer day-to-day life without a king back in Spain to tell us what to do? Well, the juntas are going to be kind of split. Some are going to be loyal to the King of Spain. Okay, we'll wait. And if he comes back, we'll give him back power. But other more radical juntas, they're going to say, we already made a government. The king's no longer in power. Let's become an independent nation. Let's become an independent country free of the Spanish oppression. So these are all causes of the Latin American wars of independence. The Enlightenment is a big influence. We will see that even after the revolution. Ideas of race and hierarchy, these are motivations. The idea of who is represented in government. Should it be a small minority of peninsulares, or should it be a small minority of Creoles? Anyway, no matter what, let's protect private property, even if it means screwing over poor and people of color. Generally, what will result from Latin American independence? Well, there are a few results. Well, obviously, Latin American independence is going to lead to independence. All of these revolutions in Latin America are going to lead to independence. We do see this concept known as popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that a people in a local area, they should choose their own government. So ideas of popular sovereignty will be introduced into Latin America thanks to these Latin American independence. We will see the rise of new countries, of independent countries that will form republics inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment. So we do see that much like with the United States, much like with France, much like with Haiti, ideas of the Enlightenment will be applied after independence in new constitutions. So independence, that's a pretty obvious thing. The application of Enlightenment ideas into politics, that's a huge result of Latin American independence. But much like with, say, the French Revolution, much like, say, with the American Revolution, the same rich white people who were prominent in colonial society, they're going to be prominent after independence. Traditional elites will maintain their power, especially the Creoles, especially native-born whites in the Americas. So, much like with the United States, the same rich white guys in charge before the revolution, they're in charge after the revolution. Did anything change? Yes, some things changed, independence and popular sovereignty, but also no, things didn't change. The same people are in charge. People of color, poor people, women, even though they will greatly be involved in independence movements, they're going to be denied those civil liberties, those ideas of the Enlightenment that were motivating Creoles to revolt, that helped get African Americans, people of native descent, women on board with things. It's not going to be applied evenly to them. So we are going to see in many Latin American countries extremely high wealth divisions, and especially a division between planters, so really rich landowners, and poor farmers. Because many societies in Latin America are not going to industrialize the same way as North America will. There are a few exceptions, obviously, but for the most part, it's not to the same scale as the United States or Europe or Japan. So we are going to see that there are a lot of class divisions, especially in rural countryside between farmers and farming elites. And we do see oftentimes there will be conflict, there will be political instability, especially over what type of government will these post-independent societies look like. So we are going to see a lot of internal conflict, especially between rival philosophies of government. So we are going to see generally in the 1800s a conflict between two factions generally in Latin American societies. On the one hand, we've got liberals. Those dirty libs. Obviously, that was a joke. So liberals in the 1800s in Latin America believe really in a few things. They believe in this idea known as federalism, and you should be able to define federalism. Federalism is a system that the United States has, for example. It is a system of government in which national government has some power, has some responsibility, and then there is some power and some responsibility shared with local government, with state governments, for example, to use the United States. So the idea of balancing power between the national and local governments, liberals tend to be in favor of that in Latin America. Liberals in Latin America tend to also be in favor of secularism. Remember, the Enlightenment, all about that secularism. It is a movement about reason, about secularism. Those are big ideas of the Enlightenment, as well as the concept of natural rights. So liberals tend to be anti-church. They tend to want to diminish or decrease the influence of the Catholic Church. So they want to change that aspect of former colonial society. They want to decrease the influence of the Catholic Church after independence. How successful are they going to be? Well, that's something we'll explore more at the end of this unit, but also towards the end of the year as well, actually. I think the second to last presentation is about Latin America in the 20th century. All right. Liberals also tend to be in favor of land reform. Liberals in the 1800s are capitalists. I mean, they still are to this modern day, but liberals are capitalists. And they believe that the rights to participate in government are largely going to be along the idea of property ownership qualifications. But liberals in the 1800s tend to believe that the idea is that in order to encourage more democracy, we need to encourage greater division of land. We need to break up the power of huge landed elites, and we want to encourage small farmers to own independent farms. We want to encourage what we call yeoman farmers, the idea of a self-sufficient small-time farmer. So the idea of encouraging land reform in order to make a more balanced system of wealth distribution, that's something that will be generally believed by liberals, and we'll look at a good example of that in Mexico. Conservatives in Latin America, they tend to believe in something called centralism. Centralism is the idea of a strong national government, less power to local government, less power to cities and counties and states. I almost knocked down my computer back. Conservatives tend to be more religious, to preserve the authority of the Catholic Church, our good friends in the Catholic Church. Conservatives also tend to be in favor of maintaining traditional elites, of maintaining this balance between very rich people and very not rich people. So keeping old social hierarchies, preserving landed elites, they tend to be in favor and be supported by the military, the military. And we will see that a common trend in several Latin American countries is going to be that the military is going to exert a really large influence over politics. Sometimes that leads to dictatorships, but we'll talk about that more in the future. All right, so keep going. So you should be able to define general causes and results. If anything you would need to know for your Unit 5 test in this class, it would be causes and results. And these are important things also for the AP exam. So let's look at specific examples of Latin American countries. But before we do that, this is a map of how independence, when it roughly is achieved. We are going to look at a little bit the military campaigns, especially the leadership of this guy right here, Simón Bolívar. And he's right there, actually, Simón Bolívar. Hi, nice to meet you, Simón Bolívar. Who are you? Well, first, in order to provide context, let's turn to one of the earliest independence movements in Latin America, and that is going to lead us to New Granada. New Granada is modern-day Colombia, modern-day, modern-day Venezuela, modern-day Ecuador. So these three countries, modern-day, roughly. So New Granada was a Spanish viceroyalty, and it is going to be one of the earliest places to declare independence. But let's see that process just to show how general causes and results are displayed in Latin America. Well, in New Granada, after Napoleon invades, after he invades Spain, I should say, after the Spanish king is thrown out of power, I should really look up his name, the Spanish king. Anyway, we are going to see that the temporary governments that form, the juntas that form, are going to be split between patriots, those that want independence, and royalists, those that want to remain in Spain. They are the loyalists, I guess, to use a a similar term from APUSH. And this is going to lead to a conflict within New Granada between the Patriot government and the Royalist government. So there is a huge military conflict that is going to happen as a result of Spain becoming without a king, at least temporarily. And a figure is going to emerge that is going to lead the Patriot side to victory militarily, and that man's name is Simón Bolívar. If there's one figure to associate with Latin American independence, it's this boy right here, Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar, the George Washington, the liberator of South America. And who is Bolivar? Well, as I've been saying, Simón Bolívar is going to be one of the primary leaders of Latin American independence. He is a majorly successful military leader, but he's also a majorly successful political idealist as well. And a lot of the ideals of Latin American independence can kind of be traced back to the character of Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar is going to adopt a lot of Enlightenment ideas into his political philosophy. He uses the Enlightenment, its ideas of natural rights, as justification for the independence movement. So he is going to be successful militarily, but I want to focus on the political aspect of things. How is Bolivar channeling Enlightenment thought into independence? How is he getting people across the different castas on board with independence? Well, in order to explain that, we have a very important piece of outside evidence you could potentially use if a LEQ or DBQ was about the Enlightenment or about this age of revolutions or about decolonization. And that is the letter from Jamaica. The letter from Jamaica was a letter that Simón Bolívar wrote while he was in exile in, you guessed it, Jamaica. And essentially, he is going to, in this document that will be eventually published and widely distributed throughout South America, he's going to make the case for why Latin America should be independent. He's trying to appeal to Creoles, so to white property owners who might be on the fence about supporting independence, and people of color as well. And the letter of from Jamaica is going to use Enlightenment principles in its appeals to Creoles and people of color, to people of African and Native descent. Because the letter from Jamaica is going to make an appeal to Creoles in listing grievances against mercantilism. Mercantilism, remember, that restriction of trade between the colonies and the mother country, was something that seemingly violated that natural right to property. Shouldn't I be able to sell my goods as when I want, to who I want, where I want? Well, that idea of property ownership being taken away, that is something that Bolivar is going to emphasize in his letter from Jamaica. He's trying to get white Creoles on board with independence by being against the Spanish system of mercantilism. But he's also going to try and get people of color on board, especially people of African descent on board. And he is going to actually explain his reasons against slavery as well. He is going to realize in order to get more people on the side of independence, in order to get people of African descent on the side of independence, I am going to advocate for ending chattel slavery. And something that we will see, one of the other results of Latin American independence that speaks to the relationship between the Haitian Revolution and Latin American independence is going to be that many Latin American countries will abolish slavery pretty soon after independence. Bolivar will make good on that promise, I suppose. But also in the letter from Jamaica, Bolivar does express ideas that are a bit more, you could say, conservative, I guess. You could say, in terms of his political vision for independent Latin America, that is a bit more what I characterized as conservative. So we do see Bolivar has this idea that in order for a strong South America to resist encroachment, to resist imperialism, or I should say further colonialism by Spain or Portugal, he believes in this idea that Latin America, that South America specifically, has united common goals. And that if Latin America became independent, he's going to say in the letter from Jamaica, it should be one big old unified country. He has a big vision of a strong, centralized South America, one that is unified. And this concept of kind of saying that there is common cause among the people of South America for independence, for political ideas. We call this idea Pan-Americanism, the idea of a unified South American nation. That's Pan-Americanism. So the letter from Jamaica expresses these different ideas. It's very much Enlightenment inspired in how it is opposed to mercantilism because of the argument that mercantilism violates natural right to property, but also, of course, slavery tends to be against the idea of liberty. I mean, that's just my observation. I'm pretty woke, I know. Anyway, Simón Bolívar is going to be very successful in unifying and freeing and liberating South America from the Spanish. And that kind of brings us back to this chart right here. Simón Bolívar will lead successful independence movements across New Granada. That's this area right here with Caracas, Bogota, and Quito. And he's also going to help out in Peru's independence as well. So Simón Bolívar, very major figure to associate with Latin American independence. I would just know who he is. He's very important for your understanding of world history. So what's going to happen after the royalists, after the Peninsulares are kicked out of New Granada? Well, New Granada is going to change its name to Gran Colombia. And Gran Colombia is a big centralist style government. However, if we're thinking about those results of Latin American independence, a big result is the fact that there are political divisions between liberals and conservatives, centralists versus federalists. And there are people in Latin America that believe that if there is a strong centralist government in Gran Colombia, then that could potentially diminish the influence of local white elites. So we do see that that will lead to independence movements within Gran Colombia. Gran Colombia is going to experience political divisions. There's not necessarily a civil war, but we will see that Gran Colombia will break up into independent, smaller countries, places like Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador. And these three places aren't all, I mean, they're important, obviously. But I guess kind of, if we're thinking about that idea of Pan-Americanism, it never worked out because of these debates between centralists and federalists. Centralists believed in a strong national unified government, whereas federalists wanted strong local government. And that, unfortunately, does not work out for Simón Bolívar. These divisions prove too much. Gran Colombia splits up into at least 3 different countries. All right, so that's Gran Colombia right there. Causes we saw, it's that idea of the juntas, the Enlightenment inspiration. We saw that in the letter from Jamaica, military conflict. And then we saw results, conflict between centralists and federalists, between liberals and conservatives. All right, so let's go down south to Argentina. Don't cry for me, Argentina. The truth is, we've got to talk about independence. If you're a fan of Evita, you would get that. Anyway, no one's a fan of Evita. It's like the least listened to musical of the 1970s, unfortunately. It's kind of sexist. Anyway, that's a whole different discussion. I do talk about Juan Perón, though, in a different, never mind. All right. So Argentina will follow kind of those similar trends. Enlightenment inspiration, but there's also going to be an internal conflict between royalists and patriots. The patriots who want independence, they win. Woohoo! 1816, Argentina gets its independence. It becomes the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. And this has the implication of Argentina being a federalist society. And it is going to be one, but that's not without internal conflict, actually. We do see that that will result in internal conflict after independence, and I'll get to that in just a second. Just to throw out another name that's associated with Latin American independence that sometimes appears in prep material is this guy right here with the sideburns, a guy by the name of José de San Martín. José de San Martín is essentially kind of the military liberator of the more southern South American countries, places like Chile, places like Argentina, parts of Peru, modern-day Bolivia, these sorts of places. Although Bolivia, Simón Bolívar was also there. Anyway, So there is a military conflict, a conflict between royalists and patriots that will lead to kind of independence after the Patriots win the Super Bowl. But after independence, we do see that there is degree of political instability. There is a conflict. Are we centralist? Are we conservative? Are we liberal? Are we federalist? And at the end of the day, federalists are going to win. The liberal federalists are going to win. And actually, I would say that Argentina kind of embodies very similar trends as the United States in many ways. Argentina, comparatively, is more industrialized than South America. It's a strong exporting country. And it is going to be an economic powerhouse, one with relative political and economic stability in the 1800s at the very least. So it is relatively politically stable, relatively liberal as well. So ideas of secularism, ideas of potential land reform, these are sorts of ideas that are a bit more popular in Argentina. Although that's not to say the military doesn't have some influence over politics. A lot of early South American leaders were military leaders. I guess that's the same with the United States, George Washington, after all. But for the most part, we do see that a lot of post-independence political leaders are military leaders as well. And as I said before, Argentina is going to become a relatively wealthy society. It is going to be a strong exporter of beef and cotton, and it is going to kind of embody similar trends as the United States. It will be somewhat industrialized. We'll look at that more in the future. But we also do see that much like the United States, as we'll explore more in Unit 6, Argentina is going to actually receive a lot of immigrants, actually, from Europe, from places like Chile, places like Italy, places like Spain, places like Germany. There was a pretty big German population even before World War II. All right. So now we're going to look at the Mexican War for Independence. And by golly, it is complicated, the Mexican War for Independence, because sides shift all the time. But I guess the big takeaway to take away from the War for Independence, and don't call it the Mexican Revolution, because that's a different thing in world history. We'll talk about that later. But the Mexican War for Independence is complicated insofar as we are going to see changes in who supports which idea. Creoles will initially be in support of remaining in Napoleon's control of the Spanish Empire, whereas conservatives want to break away from that and support the former King of Spain. And sides are going to shift all the time. What you would need to know overall is generally who is in charge, who is leading these revolutions, and kind of the results, of course. And I'll kind of take you through those causes and results in just a second. This is a good crash course video. I would watch the whole video because it is good at explaining these general themes, but also at the specific historic events as well. Let's go to... All right, let's not go to the thought bubble. All right, so let's take a look at Mexico. Mexico. Well, if we think about kind of causes and effects generally, well, a general cause and effect of Latin American independence, as I said before, general cause was that division between the different castas. So a big kind of thing that will influence the debates surrounding independence is going to be a conflict between who should control Mexican society. Should it be the Creoles, whites who were born within the colony, or should it be peninsulares, whites born back in Spain? And these Creoles and peninsulares are going to get into a conflict over that temporary junta, that temporary government, when the Spanish king abdicates after Napoleon's invasion. And it is complicated because initially the Creoles want to stay in the Spanish Empire. They believe the Spanish Empire has their best interest at heart in maintaining their status in society. Mexican elites tend to be in favor of the Spanish Empire until it's not convenient for them. However, in the background of all of this, we do see that there are people among peasants, especially people of native descent, mixed race people. There's a relatively small African descent population in New Spain. All of these people tend to be more in favor of independence. They want to see radical redistribution of land and power now. They want to get rid of the Spanish. They don't like the traditional elites in New Spanish society in Mexico. Owie, my finger hurts. All right. So we are going to see that kind of this will lead to a lot of tensions. This caste system, we do see peasant uprisings. I'll look at one specific example in just a second, but we do see that kind of peasants tend to be against the Spanish government because they're upset about the uneven power distribution under colonial society. They want to see a change in that. And we also see that kind of these peasants are concerned with economic issues, namely poverty. There's a famine going on. New Spain's colony is not doing anything about that. So we do see that kind of among peasants, among people of color, among people of native descent, that there is going to be a series of revolts, of popular revolts against the Spanish government. For example, we've got the figure of Miguel Hidalgo. Miguel Hidalgo was a Creole priest. I think he was married, so he wasn't the best priest, actually. Not that being married is a bad thing. But this idea of a Creole who is going to respond to the social and economic grievances of peasants, of poor Mexican peasants. So we are going to see that there will be a series of revolts and rebellions against the Spanish monarchy. These rebellions are put down, and yet Creoles, who see it as an opportunity to get power away from Peninsulares, they tend to be the ones who support these rebellions. However, at the end of the day, remember, elites want to maintain control of society. They will switch their positions depending on the circumstance. And we are going to see eventually that elites in New Spain will feel threatened by changes going on in Spain. So back in Spain, we do see the creation of a constitutional monarchy. Liberal reforms will be made that seemingly will threaten the hold of elites over New Mexican society, over New Spanish society. So we are going to see that eventually conservatives will kind of join the Creoles, and we do see that this independence war will be successful. These Mexican conservatives, they don't want to give up their power to liberal reforms back in Spain. They see the best way to preserve their interests is to break away from Spain. So liberal reforms in Spain under a new Spanish king after Napoleon is going to anger Mexican conservatives. These conservatives will join Creoles. They'll join peasants in declaring independence. However, it's these conservatives who are in charge, these white property-owning Creoles who are in charge. Guys like Agustin de Iturbide, there we go, I said it. Agustin de Iturbide is going to lead these Mexican conservatives and establish a monarchy, establish a constitutional monarchy. But this will be eventually overthrown because of demands by peasants, demands by liberal Creoles to have a republic. Eventually, Mexico becomes a republic. So I threw a lot of information at you, but the general thing to take away from this is that elites tend to want to have their powers stay. And we are going to see that best expressed in how a monarchy will be the initial form of government Mexico has after its independence. We see that inspiration of revolts like the Haitian Revolution will inspire poor people, will inspire people of African and native descent to also join in independence. And yet their goal of what independence should look like, of equality, is not going to be realized, obviously. Who is in charge? It's still white Creoles. It's still white property owners. So let's take a look at the end of this conflict between Creoles, between liberals and conservatives. So the Mexican Republic is going to be characterized by a lot of political instability, especially between liberals and conservatives. In 1824, a federalist constitution, a seemingly liberal constitution, is put in place, and yet there is going to be a lot of controversy that this constitution is too conservative. In fact, the constitution in Mexico literally will state outright that Mexico is a Catholic country. So that's against the ideas of the Enlightenment right there. It's not a secular society. So we do see that there will be a lot of divisions over a variety of issues. These divisions include things like, what's the role of the church? What's the role of the military in government? What is the best economic system? Do we redistribute land? Do we keep traditional elites? So there's a lot of political instability. And we do see that this will result in kind of a lot of internal conflict. For example, we will see that various Central American states will break away from New Spain, from Mexico. These include places like Honduras and Nicaragua, Costa Rica. All of these places will secede in the 1830s. Foreign wars don't really help out at all. The United States takes over everything from California to Texas, so not the best neighbor to the north for Mexico. So a lot of these political problems are going to intensify internal difficulties. So there will be a lot of internal conflicts, especially between liberals and conservatives, and certainly outside factors don't help out with things. Mexico is going to become involved in a lot of internal rebellions because of secession movements. There's political weakness thanks to wars with the United States. So again, that's a general theme of political instability, especially exacerbated by wars with nearby powers, especially the United States. Let's take another look at this conflict between conservatives and liberals. So this is a prime example of some general conflict after independence in Latin America. And probably a good example of that, a very specific piece of evidence, is going to be the reaction against the Reforma movement, La Reforma, led by Benito Juarez. Juarez was actually a person of indigenous descent. He was the first Native American president of Mexico. And being a Native American, he wanted to see more equal distribution of land and political power. He wanted to embody ideas of liberalism into Mexican society. He wanted to promote small independent farmers called yeoman farmers. He wanted to create a society where land ownership was more commonly held among among men in Mexican society, including Native Americans. And the Reforma movement is going to have a few things that will upset conservatives. For one thing, we are going to see that La Reforma is going to try and limit the Catholic Church's power in Mexico. It is going to try and remove that phrase that said that Mexico is literally a Catholic country from its inception. We also see it tries to limit the military's role in politics to try and prevent military dictatorships or undue influence of the military over Mexican peasants. But also, La Reforma tried to reform land distribution. We saw an effort to try and redistribute land more fairly, especially towards Native Americans, towards people of color. However, conservatives end up winning at the end of the day because La Reforma is going to inspire an internal conflict. They're called the Reform Wars. And Mexican liberals and conservatives will fight each other. And guess what the conservatives do? They're literally going to get on the telegraph, and they're going to invite the French to invade and to preserve conservative power in Mexico. So the Mexicans are going to be invaded by the French, actually. And that will lead us to the Second Mexican Empire. You wouldn't need to know all of this information, but it's eventually overthrown. Mexico becomes a republic again. And yet, even after the overthrow of this monarchy set up by the French, we are going to see that there will be still a lot of continued problems in Mexico. We will see that the military is going to become even more important in political society. That will become very important in the 20th century, as we'll explore more. But there's also intense peasant poverty as well. We do see that American business interests, that's going to start up buying up Mexican land. And we see a huge amount of poverty, especially in the countryside, that impacts Native Americans and people of color in general. So really, a big trend in Latin American history and in Mexican history specifically is that there is going to be high inequality. There's a lot of peasant inequality. There's also a concerning influence of the military in government in Mexican history. And really, you should keep these in the back of your mind, because by the end of the year, we're going to explore something called the Mexican Revolution, in which we will see attempts to redistribute land and political power to be more fair to peasants, to poor people, and people of color. And that will be the Mexican Revolution. We'll talk about that unit 8/9. All right, let's wrap up Latin America before we look at Canada by looking at the Brazilian Empire. Brazil is like the weirdest country, in my opinion, in terms of what happens after independence. So let's take a look at that. So remember, Napoleon invaded Spain. He also invaded Portugal. And while the Spanish monarchy fled, they fled, I believe, to England. I might got that wrong, but they fled nonetheless. They might have also fled to Austria. I can't remember. But the Spanish monarchy, while they're not going to flee back to the colonies, Portugal will. The Portuguese royal family is going to literally leave, and they're going to relocate their empire back in their only colony in South America of Brazil. And for much of the early 1800s, really until the 1820s, the Portuguese monarchy lives in Brazil. So there is kind of a stronger tradition of having a monarchy in Brazil. And yet we are going to see that after this Portuguese go back to Portugal, there is an interest by white Creoles that we might be better off if we were an independent society. So we are going to see that the Creole elite of Brazil, they are going to convince the Prince of Portugal, a guy by the name of Pedro I, to declare independence. And that's what Pedro is going to do. Pedro, looking to make his own monarchy free from his daddy, a guy by the name of John, I believe, is interested in making a new country. And he does. He is going to be the constitutional monarch. He is going to make a deal with Creoles. If you give me some power, I'll give you some power. Constitutional monarchy. So Brazil is going to be a constitutional monarchy, one that will have traditional white Creole elites still in power, but they have some political rights. They have those natural rights of life, liberty, and property successfully maintained. So we are going to see that a big thing that will happen in Brazilian history is that even after independence, a lot of the same elites during colonial times, especially white property owners, are still going to be in charge after independence. And they think that a monarchy is the best way to preserve that. And Brazil is going to be a very, very highly class-based society, not only in terms of wealth, but also in terms of race as well. We are going to see very strong social and racial hierarchies. And that is going to lead us actually to a major continuity in the continued use of the plantation system. Mostly Brazil's economy is going to be focused on things that really rich property-owning elites own in Brazil. And that is large plantations called fazendas. And a fazenda is a Brazilian plantation that uses slaves, and it mostly produces cash crops like coffee and sugar. A big thing in Brazil is that slavery is going to continue well into the 1880s. Isn't it our natural right to own property? And don't we consider slaves property? Obviously, in a 21st century view, we do not, obviously. I hope you agree with me with that. But we do see that the idea of maintaining property rights, that will be a big sign of social hierarchy remaining after independence. And in fact, slavery is going to stick around until the late 1800s. By that time, there's another Pedro II in charge, in charge. His name is Pedro II. He is going to actually be in favor of abolishing slavery. And he abolishes slavery, 1888. But who does that upset? It upsets rich property owners who own large plantations. And these rich property owners are starting to remember the Enlightenment's principles. Hey, isn't it our natural right to not have our property taken away by the government? And if this government could take away our slaves, what else could they take away? So we are going to see that eventually these really big planters, these really rich elites, they are going to team up with military leaders who don't like the monarchy, who want to have power for themselves, and also a bunch of social reformers that want a republic. All of these people are going to get together. They're going to overthrow the Brazilian monarchy and replace it with a republic. And yet, even after this republic is declared, we are going to see that who controls Brazilian society. It's rich, white Creoles. It's rich, white property-owning Creoles who own large plantations. A hugely class-based society in terms of wealth and racial power. All right. So you should be able to at least pick one Latin American independence. Personally, I would pick Gran Colombia because it involves Simon Bolivar, but pick any of them and kind of describe how does it embody those ideas of causes and results that we talked about at the beginning of today's video. And finally, this is something you wouldn't need to know for your Unit 5 test, but I think it's fun to talk about. And it's also something that helps explain kind of something that's different than Latin America. You could say that this is outside evidence. You could say that this is something you could use for historical complexity if you had a proverbial, a potential, I should say, DBQ sometime in the future. I don't know, maybe next week. All right. So Canada, what's the deal with Canada? Well, Canada is going to remain a part of the British Empire. It's still a part of the Commonwealth today. It still recognizes the king. It still recognizes the King of England as the head of its government. But Canada is going to kind of be a good contrast to Latin America. Canada is going to have a greater degree of independent self-government, much like the British North American colonies did. And Canada is going to actually have a lot of self-government, even though it remains within the British Empire. There's this thing called the Confederation of 1867, which will unify Canada into one big colony. It combines all of these smaller colonies that the British had in North America into Canada. So we do see that kind of Canadian self-government is going to be a result of this Confederation Act of 1867. And the reason why I bring up Canada, because it's obviously not a part of Latin America. They don't speak Portuguese or Spanish. Quebec speaks French, obviously, but we don't see that Canada will have the same political instability that Latin America does. And why is that? Well, some historians might make the argument that since there was self-government under the British, that self-government would continue and be a strong tradition of a representative government. They have parliamentary representation. So we do kind of see that there is a strong tradition of independence in Canada, a strong independent tradition of a republic, of a representative form of government. So we are going to kind of make this argument. You could make this argument, I guess, maybe Latin American independence was so politically unstable because the Spanish and Portuguese didn't have a model for representative government. And because of that, there were a lot of internal conflicts in Latin American societies. So that's one historical argument, I guess you could make. It could be some sort of, I don't know, contextualization. It could be some sort of counter argument. Anyway, so that finishes up this chapter. I redid this chapter. I kind of emphasized more of the causes and results. That's what you would need to know. And you also need to know Simon Bolivar. So those are the three things you would need to know for Unit 5 and in general for the AP exam. Have a great day. God bless. Unless you're a liberal in post-independent Latin America who wants to reduce the influence of the Catholic Church in everyday society and want to bring about secularization, which is in line with Enlightenment ideas. I don't know. That joke kind of got away from me, isn't it? Wow. All right. Unit 5 is my favorite unit, if you haven't been able to tell. Have a grand old day with a grand old video from your favorite AP World History teacher, Mr. Ancharsky. I might not be your favorite teacher, but I'm your favorite world history teacher because I am your world history teacher and you won't have another world history teacher. Well, maybe you will. I don't know. Maybe you already had one. Maybe you switched out. I don't know. Do whatever you want. I don't care. That's your natural right. Mic drop. Peace out. All right. I'm done. Stop recording.